Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're going to be talking about optimism today. And we're going deep with this one, thanks to your pick, The Bright Side, by Sumit Paul-Choudhury.
Ooh, I like this one.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's all about how optimism actually works, where it comes from, and how it shapes us.
Yeah.
Like our whole lives, really.
Yeah, this book tackles some really interesting questions. Like, are we hardwired for optimism? Or is it something we learn along the way?
Yeah.
And is this tendency to expect good things, that optimism bias, is that actually helpful?
Right, because I think of myself as like a pretty optimistic person.
Yeah.
But sometimes I wonder if it's just setting me up for disappointment.
Yeah.
I've got friends who are like total pessimists,
Yeah.
always expecting the worst.
Yeah.
So is it all just like personality? Or is there something else going on?
Well, that's exactly what Paul-Choudhury explores.
Mhm.
And he starts off with this cool example using chicks.
Chicks.
Chicks. Researchers train these chicks to associate different colored cards with rewards.
Yeah.
Like a white card meant yummy mealworms, and a black card meant no treat. And then they introduced a gray card, something in between.
So like a test to see if the chicks would be optimistic and go for the maybe mealworm card.
Exactly. And you know what? Most of them did. They went for the gray card, like they were hoping for the best.
Really? That's so interesting.
Yeah.
But is that really optimism? Or just like a survival instinct?
Well, that's where it gets mind-blowing. The book goes on to explain how scientists did similar optimism tests with other animals too, like rats and even ants.
No way. Ants.
And guess what? They found that environment and stress actually play a role. Like stressed out creatures tend to be less optimistic.
So maybe it's not just about genetics.
Exactly. It's a mix of nature and nurture.
Yeah.
Which makes you think how much of our outlook is shaped by, how we grew up in the world around us.
Totally. It makes you question your assumptions about, what makes someone an optimist.
Right.
I'm already like asking myself all these questions just from these first few pages. It's so cool. And that whole optimism bias thing,
Yeah.
it makes you think twice about how we see the world.
Well, Paul-Choudhury brings up Neil Weinstein's work. He found that people consistently overestimate their chances of good things happening, like winning the lottery or getting that big promotion.
Oh, I totally do that. I'm always
Yeah.
like, this is going to be my lucky day.
It's more common than you think, and the book gets into the psychology behind it. There's this fascinating and kind of disturbing research on learned helplessness in dogs.
Learned helplessness. What's that?
So this researcher, Martin Seligman, he found that dogs who were repeatedly exposed to these unavoidable electric shocks, they eventually just gave up trying to escape, even when they could.
Oh, no. That's awful.
Yeah, it's sad. But the crazy part is he connected this to how we explain our successes and failures. Like, as humans...
Wait, you're saying how we explain things to ourselves could determine how optimistic we are.
Exactly. He calls it our explanatory style.
Okay.
Like, someone with a pessimistic style might see a failure as a permanent flaw. Like, I'm just bad at this.
Right.
But an optimist might say, okay, this didn't work out this time, but I can learn from it and do better next time.
Huh. I never thought of it that way. It makes you really examine how you frame those tough experiences,
Totally. It's not just about being, happy-go-lucky. It's about how we interpret what happens to us.
Yeah.
And this is just scratching the surface of what Paul-Choudhury gets into. He even takes a look at how optimism has been viewed throughout history, which is super interesting.
Oh, yeah. This is where he brings in some big philosophical ideas, right? Like Leibniz.
Yes. Leibniz believed that we live in the best of all possible worlds.
Now, that's optimistic.
Right. It's a pretty bold statement, and it sparked a lot of debate. The book even talks about Voltaire's response to this idea in Candide, this satirical novel.
I've heard of Candide, but I've never read it.
Oh, it's a wild ride. Things don't go so well for Candide, even though his mentor keeps insisting that all is for the best. It's hilarious.
Okay, I'm adding Candide to my reading list right now. It sounds like a fun way to explore some serious philosophical questions.
It really is. And it highlights how our understanding of optimism has evolved over time, especially after major events like the Lisbon earthquake in the 1700s.
Oh, right. That was a massive tragedy.
Right.
It makes sense that something like that would make people question, the idea of a divine plan
Yeah.
and start thinking more about how human actions shape the future, like a shift from blind faith to a more proactive approach.
Exactly. And from there, The Bright Side dives into how we imagine the future. And it's really cool how he connects these historical anxieties about the future to things we're dealing with today, like climate change.
Yes. He talks about reading dystopian novels during the pandemic,
Yeah.
which I totally relate to. It's hard not to feel a little anxious about the future when those kinds of stories feel almost too real.
I know, right? He even gets into the debate about having children in the face of climate change.
Yeah, I remember when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted a few years back asking if it was even okay to have kids anymore, given the state of the world.
Right. It really resonated with people.
Yeah, it definitely tapped into a widespread sense of unease. But even with all that, there's this pull towards optimism, like this hope that technology might provide solutions. And the book explores that tension.
It's like we're caught between dystopian fears and these technological hopes. And Paul-Choudhury doesn't oversimplify things. Like, he talks about the allure of solutions like geoengineering.
Right.
But he also brings up the potential risks and ethical dilemmas.
Like he's always pushing you to think critically, to weigh the possibilities without getting swept up in easy answers.
Exactly. And this is just the beginning. He goes on to discuss economic growth, the limits of using GDP as a measure of well-being, and even the work of the new optimists who argue that the world is actually getting better in many ways.
Wait, hold on. There are people out there arguing that things are actually improving. I need to hear more about this.
Yeah. Well, that's where part 2 of our deep dive begins. So, yeah, picking up where we left off, the bright side looks at the work of Hans Rosling and the new optimists. And they make this really compelling case, using all this data to show that globally, things like poverty are actually decreasing, and life expectancy is increasing.
Wow, that does sound optimistic. But can data really tell the whole story? I mean, does it really capture the actual lived experiences of people dealing with like poverty or discrimination or climate change?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Like, are those improvements across the board? Or are we just looking at averages that kind of hide the struggles of certain groups? And Paul-Choudhury really grapples with that idea. He even talks about how he was initially drawn to the new optimists' viewpoint, but then started questioning if it was maybe a little too rosy.
Yeah, like even if the numbers are trending in a positive direction, does that really mean everyone is benefiting equally? Are we kind of overlooking potential problems just because the overall picture looks good?
That's a great point. And he actually tells this really interesting story about how he realized that while the data might show progress, it doesn't always reflect what people are actually going through on the ground.
Right. It's like a reminder that we need to look beyond the numbers and really consider the human impact.
Exactly.
And speaking of looking beyond the surface, I'm curious about what he says about these optimism traps.
Uh-huh.
Because optimism can be a powerful force, but it feels like it could also lead us astray if we're not careful.
Oh, absolutely.
No.
And he dives right into that. Paul-Choudhury uses some fascinating real-world examples to illustrate this whole concept. Like, he talks about the limits to growth report from back in the 1970s.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, which predicted environmental collapse if we kept going down the same path.
Right. It was pretty controversial, right? Like some people saw it as this doom and gloom prophecy, and others thought it was a crucial warning.
Exactly. And the book doesn't take sides. It presents both perspectives and kind of leaves you to ponder. Like, who got it right? Was it a case of being overly pessimistic or a sign that we just weren't paying attention to the warnings?
It's a cautionary tale for sure.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the dangers of clinging to either extreme, like blind optimism or unwavering pessimism.
Totally.
There has to be some kind of middle ground.
And he also brings up the story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, which is like a perfect example of how unrealistic optimism and this fake it till you make it mentality can lead to disaster.
Oh my gosh, that whole story is crazy. It just shows that optimism needs to be grounded in reality. You can't just ignore potential problems or think you can wish them away.
Totally. And the book keeps going. He goes on to explore this whole effective altruism movement, which is all about using evidence and reason to make the biggest positive impact. But even they face challenges, especially when trying to address these long-term risks like artificial intelligence.
That's fascinating. So even with the best intentions and a commitment to doing good, navigating these complex issues isn't easy.
Right. It's like a reminder that there are no easy answers. We need to be willing to really engage with the complexities and be honest about the potential pitfalls, even as we strive for a better future.
Totally. And that kind of brings us back to this question of, are we wired for optimism? Or is it something we can learn and develop? Does Paul-Choudhury offer any insights on that?
He does. He discusses Martin Seligman's work on learned optimism, which suggests that we can actually train ourselves to have a more optimistic outlook.
So even if someone is naturally more pessimistic,
Yeah.
they can learn to reframe their thinking and start to see the possibility of positive outcomes.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And he even gives some practical strategies for doing this, which I found really helpful.
It's like a self-help guide for the intellectually curious. It's really cool. It makes me wonder if optimism is more of a skill than a personality trait.
That's a really good point. And throughout the book, Paul-Choudhury weaves together all these different threads, history, philosophy, psychology, even economics, to create this really rich tapestry of how optimism has shaped our world and how it continues to influence our lives.
Yeah, it's clear that this isn't just a book about thinking positive. It's about grappling with some of the biggest questions facing humanity, right? Like, is the world getting better or worse?
Yeah.
Can we control our own destiny? And what role does optimism play in shaping the future?
Absolutely. It's deep stuff, but it's written in a way that's really engaging and accessible.
Right.
He even brings in personal anecdotes and experiences to illustrate his points, which makes it feel so relatable.
That's what I love about a good deep dive. When an author can take these complex ideas and make them feel relevant to everyday life, you know?
And that's what makes The Bright Side so compelling. It's not just a collection of theories and research findings. It's like a personal exploration of what it means to be optimistic in a world that often feels anything but.
It sounds like he's not afraid to get vulnerable and share his own struggles with finding and maintaining a sense of optimism.
Not at all. He talks about dealing with grief and loss and how these experiences led him to seek a more pragmatic, reasoned kind of optimism.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, hey, I'm not some detached observer. I'm going through this too.
That makes it feel so much more authentic and human.
Yeah.
Like, it's not about preaching from some ivory tower. It's about sharing a journey and inviting readers to come along.
Exactly. And speaking of journeys, he takes you on this fascinating exploration of different time perspectives, how people view the past, present, and future, and how these perspectives can shape our outlook.
Oh, that's right. He even includes a little quiz you can take to figure out your own time perspective. I need to check that out.
Yeah, it's fun. And it can be quite insightful. He connects this to the idea of possible worlds, this notion that our ability to imagine different futures can influence our actions and expectations.
It's like he's saying we're not just passive observers. We have the power to create the future we want.
Exactly. And that's where the real power of optimism lies. Not in denying the challenges, but in believing in our ability to overcome them. It's about cultivating a sense of agency and hope.
So it's not about wearing rose-colored glasses and pretending everything is perfect. It's about seeing the world as it is, complex, messy, full of challenges and opportunities, and choosing to focus on the potential for positive change.
That's it. And the book really makes you think about what kind of future we're creating. Are we headed towards dystopia, or is there a more optimistic path? And what role do we each play in shaping that outcome?
It sounds like a call to action disguised as this captivating exploration of optimism, like the kind of book that makes you want to put it down and go do something, to make a difference, however small.
Yeah. And that's what I love about The Bright Side. It's not just thought-provoking, it's inspiring. It leaves you feeling empowered, not overwhelmed.
It's like a shot of intellectual espresso, energizing, thought-provoking, and with a surprisingly long-lasting effect.
I like that.
So if you're feeling a little down about the state of the world, or just curious about the power of optimism, I highly recommend picking up a copy of The Bright Side. It's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It really seems like The Bright Side is more than just like a deep dive into optimism. It's like an exploration of what it means to be human, in this world full of complexities and contradictions.
Totally. It tackles these big universal questions, but it always brings it back to that personal level, which is what makes it so relatable.
And after this deep dive, I'm definitely feeling that pull to pick up a copy myself. I'm curious to see how Paul-Choudhury ties all of these threads together and what kind of hopeful yet realistic vision of the future he paints.
Well, I don't want to spoil the ending, but I will say he offers a really nuanced perspective on what it means to be optimistic in the face of all this uncertainty. It's not about ignoring the challenges. It's about finding ways to navigate them while still believing in the possibility of a better future.
That's what I'm taking away from this conversation. That true optimism isn't about blind faith or denial. It's about finding that balance between acknowledging the difficulties and still holding on to that spark of hope.
And he even challenges the reader to consider what kind of optimism they want to cultivate. Is it the kind that focuses on individual happiness, or the kind that's driven by a desire to make a difference in the world?
I love that he leaves you with those questions to ponder. It's like he's saying, here's what I've learned. Now go out and find your own path to a brighter future.
Totally. And ultimately, I think that's what makes The Bright Side such a powerful and timely read. It's a reminder that even in a world that often feels dark and overwhelming, we have the capacity to choose hope, to choose action, and to choose to believe in a better tomorrow.
It's been an amazing deep dive, and I think I speak for both of us when I say we're leaving this conversation feeling a little more optimistic, a little more empowered, and definitely eager to explore the bright side for ourselves.
Absolutely. We hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and maybe even inspired you to look at the world and your own outlook in a new light.
So grab a copy of The Bright Side, dive in, and let us know what you discover. We always love hearing from our listeners.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into optimism. We hope you'll join us again next time as we explore another fascinating topic and unpack the wisdom hidden within its pages.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep looking for those bright sides, wherever they may be.